Serafina's hands were shaking when Nora stepped back from the last pearl button, and she stood in front of the tall mirror for the first time that morning and looked at herself completely. The trembling was not from cold. The eastern dressing chamber of Whitmore Hall was warm enough, heated since before dawn by the small stone fireplace set into the far wall. It was not from exhaustion either, though she had slept very little across the past 3 nights, lying in the dark with her eyes open, and her mind running through calculations that never quite resolved. The shaking came from somewhere deeper than either of those things. It was the kind of physical response that arrives when a person has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the moment to either set it down or carry it the rest of the way has finally, irreversibly arrived. She studied her reflection carefully, the way she studied most things, without flinching. The ivory gown was extraordinary, and she would acknowledge that without reservation. Clara, who had managed Cale Dorvain's household for 11 years, with the focused precision of someone who believed that mediocrity was a personal failing, had impeccable judgment about such things. The gown was cut from heavy silk, fitted cleanly at the waist, and falling to the floor in a long, unbroken line, with a train that extended behind her like something still being written. The sleeves were delicate, worked with small embroidered patterns of moonflower, which was the symbol of the northern binding ceremony. Every detail was correct. Every detail had been chosen by someone who was not her. She looked like a queen. She looked like the portrait of a woman whose life was exactly what the dress suggested. And she looked, she thought, with a very small and carefully contained sadness, nothing at all like herself. "You look beautiful," Nora said from behind her. Her voice was gentle and entirely too measured. Serafina had known Nora's voice long enough to hear what lived underneath particular versions of it. This one carried worry, the kind that had been accumulating for weeks, in the private and loyal way that Nora handled most difficult things, observing, saying nothing, maintaining composure, while the concern built quietly inside her. "Thank you," Serafina said. She moved to the tall window. Below, the grounds of Whitmore Hall were already alive with movement. The soft rumble of vehicles arriving through the estate gates, the brisk instructions of Diana, the event coordinator, whose capacity for managing large gatherings was matched only by her intolerance for anything less than precise execution. The voices of guests, drifting up from the courtyard, people she had never met attending an event that was nominally about her, but had very little to do with who she actually was. They had come from everywhere. Pack leaders from the Northern Range, council elders from 3 separate governance bodies, diplomatic representatives from territories that existed more in historical documents than in her daily awareness. And moving through all of it, with the particular kind of authority that does not require announcement, was the man she was about to marry. Cale Dorvain, the Alpha King. She had practiced saying that name inside her head without reacting to it. She had gotten reasonably good at it over 6 months of practice. But standing here this morning, listening to the sound of his gathered world below her window, the reaction came back without permission. Cale Dorvain was not a man about whom gentle things were said. People spoke of him the way they spoke of geological formations and weather events, with a kind of careful, measured respect that was, if you listened closely, really just a refined acknowledgement of power. He had inherited the Alpha King's throne at 21, after his father's sudden death, and in the 8 years since he had demonstrated an absolute command of the one thing that separated capable leaders from extraordinary ones. He understood that lasting power was never achieved through force alone, but through the construction of conditions that made any alternative to cooperation more costly than cooperation itself. 6 neighboring pack regions had come under Northern Territory authority during his tenure, not one by direct conflict. He had simply moved through each situation with the patient, methodical intelligence of someone who was not in a hurry, because he already knew how it would end, and one by one, the regions had aligned. By the time anyone outside his immediate circle fully understood what had been accomplished, the map was different, and Cale Dorvain was sitting at its center, with the composed expression of a man to whom this had always seemed inevitable. Serafina had made a point of understanding all of this before she agreed to marry him. She believed in working with full information. The proposal had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. A courier from the Northern Territory had delivered it to the gate of her family's estate, and she had taken it inside and opened it at the kitchen table, while her mother stood at the counter and kept her back turned in the careful way she kept her back turned when she wanted Serafina to have a moment with something important before she had to share it. The letter was 2 pages. Formal language, precise structure, not a word wasted. Cale Dorvain was seeking a permanent binding alliance through marriage. The candidate he was requesting was Serafina Elaine Ashwood. The terms were listed clearly. Restoration of the Ashwood family name to the Eastern Alliance Registry. Clearance of all outstanding family financial obligations. Placement of the family under Northern Territory protection. And a monthly provision administered in perpetuity. In return, the marriage would invoke the Eastern Bloodline Clause, preventing any Eastern Pact coalition from challenging Northern Territory boundary claims on historical grounds. She had read it twice. Then she had set it down and looked at the garden through the kitchen window, where the last roses of autumn were losing their petals one by one in the early cold. The Ashwood family had been declining for 8 years. Her father had possessed genuine warmth and a generous intelligence, but he had trusted an alliance partner who did not deserve trust, and lost 3 territories in a single negotiation that went wrong in every way a negotiation can go wrong. The years he spent attempting to recover what was lost consumed his health, and eventually, he simply ran out of time. He died when she was 19, leaving behind a reduced estate, accumulated debts, and 2 children, her, and Colin, who was 15 then, and brilliant in the way that people are brilliant when they have been taught to observe the world carefully and have not yet been given enough resources to match the size of their ideas. Her mother had managed everything that followed with the kind of quiet, absolute determination that Serafina had spent years admiring and trying to understand the source of. The estate was kept clean and properly maintained. Every social obligation that could be met was met. Her mother never, in Serafina's presence, showed anything other than calm and measured optimism. But Serafina had seen the financial documents. She had watched Colin defer his studies twice and take employment at a territory administrative office because asking their mother for help would have required her mother to say out loud how limited the resources were. She had looked at the proposal on the kitchen table and thought about all of this very directly. And then she had thought about herself, not last, as she might once have done, but alongside everything else, with equal weight. She had always known that she was more than her circumstances currently allowed her to be. Not arrogantly. She was not an arrogant person. But honestly, she had a mind that worked quickly, and a judgment she trusted, and an appetite for the world that the corner she currently occupied did not come close to satisfying. The proposal was a door that was wider than any she currently stood in front of. She had written back with 3 requested amendments to the terms, clearer language around the financial provisions, her brother's name included specifically in the protection clause, and an annual review requirement administered by a neutral legal body. She had not expected him to accept all 3 without a counteroffer. His response arrived in 48 hours, with every revision incorporated. That told her something about the quality of his judgment before she had met him in person. They met 4 times in the months before today. The first meeting was formal and structured, conducted with the cautious politeness of 2 people, taking each other's measure, with no intention of showing that they were doing so. He asked good questions. She answered them clearly, and asked equally good ones in return, which he answered without hesitation. She had come home and written detailed notes. The second meeting was a tour of Whitmore Hall, an orientation, Clara called it. He showed her the property with a measured, practical manner, explaining relevant operational details without performance. He did not attempt to impress her. She found that either very confident or simply indifferent to her impression, and she was not yet certain which. The third meeting had been the one she had not adequately prepared for. They had walked through a small public garden on a gray winter afternoon, and she had made a careful observation about the difference between ambition and the simple hunger for results, and he had responded with something precise and unexpected, and she had laughed. Not socially, not carefully, but actually. And when she looked at him, his expression had shifted for one unguarded moment, and she had seen something behind the composed surface of his silver eyes that she had not anticipated. She had gone home and argued with herself about those 4 seconds for a full week. She had resolved the argument correctly, she was certain. 4 seconds of unexpected warmth was not evidence of anything. She had made this decision with her head, and she was going to maintain it with her head. Standing at the window of the dressing room this morning, she adjusted her grip on the bouquet of white gardenias and said to herself, clearly and without sentiment, I know what this is. I am not going in blind. Nora, she said, give me a few minutes alone, please. Nora left without a sound. Serafina stood in the room by herself and breathed and listened to the grounds below. She thought about her grandmother, who had died 3 years ago, and whose voice surfaced in her memory with the particular clarity of someone who had said important things in ways that could not be forgotten. Her grandmother had survived 2 political betrayals and a forced relocation, and had maintained a standard of composure throughout that most people could not have managed even one of those things with. She had told Serafina, "You can feel whatever you feel. That is entirely your right. But you carry yourself like your name means something, and eventually, the world decides that it does." She put the bouquet in her left hand and pressed her right palm flat against the cool glass of the window. Then she opened the dressing room door and stepped into the eastern corridor. She needed to walk, to feel the ground under her feet, to remind herself that she was a person making a choice, not a figure being moved by someone else's intention. The corridor was quiet at this hour, the staff redirected to the event areas, the stone walls lined with old portraits of people whose significance had outlasted their names. She walked slowly, the train of her gown trailing silently behind her, and the steadiness she needed began to return with each step. She was nearly at the far end of the corridor when she heard voices through a door that had not been fully closed. Her feet stopped without any instruction. The voice was Cale's. She recognized it immediately. That particular quality of measured, unhurried control. The voice of a man who had decided a long time ago that clarity was more effective than emphasis. Beside it was a lower, more cautious voice. Rowan, his second in command, who had been introduced at the second meeting as both aide and trusted counsel. She did not move closer. She did not need to. The corridor carried the sound perfectly. "The council is satisfied," Cale was saying. "The binding activates the bloodline clause the moment the ceremony concludes. At that point, the Eastern Pact Coalition has no legal standing to challenge the territorial boundary without challenging an Ashwood alliance, which means challenging 7 generations of Eastern Covenant history. They will not attempt it." "And if they do?" Rowan asked. "They won't. The symbolic cost is too high. The Ashwood name carries enough historical authority in the Eastern Territories to make any challenge appear as an aggression against the Covenant itself. That's the entire calculation." A brief silence. "And the woman?" Rowan asked. His voice was careful. The voice of someone choosing to ask a question they already suspected the answer to. Serafina's fingers pressed hard against the stems of her gardenias. "She is capable," Cale said, port composed. "She will perform the public dimension of the role correctly. Her family circumstances ensure she is sufficiently motivated to maintain the arrangement without complication." "That is not what I asked," Rowan said. A longer silence. 3 seconds. "She is a means to an end," Cale said. His voice had not changed at all. Not harder, not colder, not anything. It was the same precise, level tone he used to discuss boundary clauses and administrative schedules. "The binding is a legal instrument. The bloodline is what the arrangement requires. Nothing further is relevant to it." Rowan was quiet. "And if she expects otherwise?" he asked. "That," Cale said, "would be her own mistake to manage." Serafina stood in the corridor. She stood there long enough for the morning light at the far window to shift slightly, long enough for the sound of the reception preparations below to continue as though nothing had changed, because outside this corridor, nothing had. She thought about the third meeting, about 4 seconds, about the argument she had resolved in favor of clarity over feeling, and how confident she had been in that resolution, and how somewhere in a part of herself she had not been entirely honest about. She had still been holding on to something, not love. She had not let it go that far, but possibility. The small, stubborn possibility that a man capable of that particular 4-second shift was capable of something more than pure calculation. She let go of it now, completely, cleanly. She placed it in a closed drawer inside herself and turned the key. What she put in its place was something colder and considerably more useful. She turned around. She walked back down the corridor in complete silence, her gown moving behind her, her bouquet in her hands, her chin at exactly the angle it had been when she entered. When she reached the window, she stood for one more moment and looked out at the approaching ceremony and everything that was about to happen. Cale Dorvain believed he was the only person in this arrangement with a strategy. That was the first and most consequential error he had made. When Nora appeared at the end of the hallway 2 minutes later, Seraphina Ashwood was standing at the window, with the particular quality of stillness, that is not peace, but is what comes after peace, has been set aside, in favor of something more purposeful. "They are ready," Nora said softly. "Good," Seraphina said. "Are you all right?" Nora asked, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had known her too long to be misled by composed expressions. "Yes," she said. "I am." She was not, in the way Nora meant. But she was something better than all right, in the only way that mattered right now. She was entirely, completely, unflinchingly clear about what she was walking toward, and what she intended to do about it. She walked to the chapel door with her head high and her name held straight, and a purpose so deeply settled in her chest that the 200 people gathered inside that beautiful stone chapel, looking at her, as she came through the doors and into the morning light, saw nothing in her face except a woman who was exactly where she had chosen to be. Which was, she thought, precisely accurate. The inside of the chapel was exactly as she had expected, which meant it was more than she had fully prepared herself for. She had visited it once before, during the estate orientation in the second meeting with Cale. At that time it had been empty and undisturbed, stripped of any arrangement, just stone and old wood, and the particular stillness of a room that had held important moments for a very long time, without growing lesser for the weight of them. She had thought then that it was a beautiful space, in a severe way, not warm, not designed to comfort anyone, but honest, the kind of beauty that does not try to be something it is not. Now it was full. Every pew on both sides of the narrow central aisle was occupied. 200 people turned toward her as she appeared in the doorway, and the sound of 200 people going silent at once was something she felt as much as heard, a wave of collective attention that had a physical weight to it, pressing against her from all sides. The morning light came through the high windows, in long, pale columns that touched the stone floor, and the pale winter greenery, arranged along the pew ends, and the embroidered shoulders of the people who had assembled, from every allied territory and diplomatic relationship that Cale Dorvain had spent 8 years constructing. She walked. She had always been good at walking into difficult rooms, at projecting a steady, unhurried forward motion that communicated certainty without arrogance, the kind of movement that made the room understand it was being entered by someone who had decided, entirely, to be there. She used that skill now with everything she had. She kept her gaze directed forward, toward the altar stone and the officiant who stood before it in the formal silver robes of the northern binding ceremony, and toward Cale. He was standing at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him, and his back perfectly straight, dressed in charcoal and silver, and he was watching her come down the aisle with an expression she had learned to read during 4 meetings, the expression he wore when he was paying close, careful attention to something, assessment behind a composed face. He was watching the way she carried the bouquet, the way she looked at the room, the way she covered the distance between the door and him. She met his eyes when she was close enough, and she held them, and she did not allow him to see one single thing that was happening underneath her composure. She arrived at the altar and stood beside him. The chapel was warm now from 200 bodies, the candles on the altar adding their own small, steady heat. The officiant, a gray-eyed elder man who had performed this ceremony many times and understood its weight without finding it heavy, began to speak. "We are gathered under the laws of blood and binding," he said, "to witness the formal covenant between Cale Aldous Dorvain, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and Seraphina Elaine Ashwood, of the Ashwood bloodline of the Eastern Range. This binding, once spoken and sealed, carries the full weight of ancestral law and the authority of this assembled witness." She had memorized the ceremony text weeks ago, reading it at her desk in the guest room of her family's estate, with a cup of tea growing cold and forgotten beside her. She had read it because she believed in knowing exactly what she was agreeing to, down to the last word. Cale's vows came first. He recited them in the same voice he used for everything, clear, unhurried, leaving nothing blurred or uncertain. He spoke of protection and loyalty, and the binding of 2 names, and the words were well crafted and correct in every technical and ceremonial sense, and they meant exactly what they said, and very probably nothing else. Then it was her turn. She said her vows clearly. She said every word fully and without hesitation, because she had decided, in the corridor an hour ago, that she was not going to perform this in half measures. She was going to be present, completely, in what she had agreed to, and she was going to use that presence for her own purposes. She said the words that promised loyalty and partnership, and the joining of two names, and she felt each one as she said it, and she kept her eyes on the officiant, because looking at Cale would have made the distance between the words and the reality too precise and too sharp. The officiant completed the sealing words. He asked both parties to place their hands upon the binding stone, an ancient piece of white granite set into the center of the altar, worn smooth by generations of use. She pressed her right hand to it. Cale pressed his beside hers. The stone was cold and very real beneath her palm. "By blood and word and witness," the officiant said, "the binding is complete." There was a sound from the assembled witnesses. Not applause exactly, and not silence, but something between the two. The long breath of a room, releasing what it has been holding. Cale turned to her. He was close enough that she could see the exact composition of his silver eyes and the precise, maintained control within them. He leaned forward to complete the formal seal of the ceremony with the expected gesture, and she received it with perfect composure, and did not show him a single thing. The chapel doors opened. They walked out together into the pale morning, and the light fell on them both equally and without preference. The reception banquet was held in the main hall of Whitmore Hall, and two adjoining rooms that had been opened for the occasion. The main hall was a double-height space with old stone walls hung with tapestries and long tables that could seat 40 people each, arranged now with the precision Clara applied to everything she managed. Silver centerpieces, deep winter greenery, long candles in tall holders, crystal that scattered the light from the chandeliers above in small, shifting points across the white tablecloths. 240 guests. She had been given the final count the previous morning. For the first hour, she and Cale moved through the room together, performing the ritual circuit of formal greetings that an event of this scale required. Pack leaders, whose names she had memorized from the guest list. Council elders she had studied in preparation for the role. Diplomatic representatives from regions she knew primarily from maps and historical documents. She met every one of them with the warm, measured manner of a woman who was entirely at ease in this environment. She was not at ease, but she was very good at presenting as though she were. Good enough that not one of the people she spoke to would have suspected otherwise. Cale was exceptional at this dimension of public life. She had understood this intellectually before today, but watching him move through a room of this composition was a different kind of understanding. He remembered every name and every relevant detail about every person he encountered, and the people he spoke to responded with a particular brightening. Not because he was warm, he was not warm, but because he gave the kind of focused, genuine attention that makes a person feel they have been actually seen, rather than merely acknowledged. She watched this with the neutral appreciation of someone observing a skill they can respect separately from the person who possesses it. After the first circuit, the natural movement of the event separated them. She was drawn into a longer conversation with a group of Eastern Pack matriarchs who had known her grandfather personally and wanted to tell her this, and wanted her to know that the Ashwood name was still regarded with genuine respect in the Eastern communities. She listened with care. These women, and what they represented, were exactly why she had made the decision she had made, and nothing she had heard this morning changed that. The people on the Eastern Range had done nothing wrong, and had been promised something that had better be delivered. The evening deepened into a full reception. The food was excellent. The conversation around her moved with the constant, low-level hum of political calculation that ran beneath the surface of every gathering like this. Everyone assessing everyone else. Everyone drawing conclusions about what this binding meant, and what it would shift in the balance of regional power. She ate and spoke and collected information with the quiet attentiveness of someone conducting serious work while appearing to simply enjoy a party. She caught glimpses of Cale across the hall at intervals throughout the evening. He was always precisely where he needed to be, talking to precisely the right person at precisely the right moment. She noticed this without resentment and without admiration. It was simply accurate information about who he was. Her old friend Celeste found her near the end of the first hour, moving through the crowd with the focused energy of someone who had been trying to reach a specific person for a while, and was relieved to have finally managed it. Celeste had attended the ceremony in a deep blue dress and an expression of composed and very careful concern. She was one of the sharpest people Serafina knew, and one of the most honestly loyal, which made her both easy and difficult to be close to. "You are doing brilliantly," Celeste said, taking her arm and drawing her slightly aside from the main current of guests. "Thank you," Serafina said. "I mean it completely. No one would know." Celeste looked at her with the direct assessment she applied to everything worth assessing. "Are you all right?" "I am managing," Serafina said, which was not the same thing, but was all she was prepared to say in this room at this moment. She pressed Celeste's hand briefly. "I need you not to worry about me tonight. I will explain when I can. Can you trust me with that?" "Always," Celeste said without hesitation. The evening moved through its formal stages. Cale gave a toast that was brief, precisely calibrated, and exactly right for the composition of the room. He acknowledged the assembled witnesses, the historical significance of the Ashwood alliance, and the intention of the binding without a single wasted word. She gave her own toast with warmth and genuine meaning, because she spoke about legacy and continuity, and what it meant to stand at the beginning of something, with full knowledge of your own history, and she meant every word of it, even though the something she had in mind was not the one the room imagined. The response to her toast was warmer than she had anticipated. Several faces in the room shifted when she spoke, people who had come expecting the quiet wife of a powerful man, and encountered instead someone with a clear voice and a precise mind, and the particular quality of calm that signals to experienced people that they are looking at someone worth paying attention to. She noted their faces. She would remember them. It was near midnight when she first saw him. She had stepped briefly away from a conversation with a pair of alliance advisors, just a moment, just a breath of actual space in the density of the evening, and she was standing near the eastern archway connecting the main hall to the secondary reception room, when she noticed a stillness that was different from the ordinary stillness of the event. He was standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the main movement of guests. He was tall, with dark hair, and the kind of face that was distinguished not by any particular perfection, but by clarity, strong features, a considered expression, and the particular quality of composure that belongs to someone who has learned that stillness communicates more than any amount of visible effort. He was dressed in deep midnight blue, which was not the silver and charcoal of the Northern Territory, not the colors of any ally she recognized immediately. She registered all of this in a single breath. And then he turned his head, and his eyes found hers across the distance of the hall, and she felt something she could not have named precisely, a sudden alignment, like a scale finding its balance point after a long time of measuring. He did not look away, neither did she. For a moment the noise of the reception receded to a distance, the way sound does when something more immediate claims your full attention. Then a footman appeared at her elbow, and she turned to receive him, and the moment closed. "My apologies, my lady," the footman said, using her former title with the slight uncertainty of someone who had not yet been briefed on the correct form. "I was asked to bring to your attention that one of this evening's guests arrived late, bearing credentials from the sovereign kingdom of Vale. His documentation has been verified by the estate's security office. His name is listed as Aldrich Vale." She turned back slowly toward the eastern wall. "The sovereign king himself," she said. It was not entirely a question. "Yes, my lady. The sovereign kingdom of Vale." She knew the name the way everyone in the supernatural world knew the name, as something that had once been enormously significant and had then gone profoundly quiet. Vale was among the oldest kingdoms in recorded history, predating the Northern Territories, predating any existing pack coalition. It had closed its borders 19 years ago, following events that were discussed in historical texts, with the careful vagueness that usually meant something complicated and painful had happened, and no one who was still living wanted to take direct responsibility for describing it. Since the closure, Vale had maintained its sovereignty in absolute silence. No diplomacy, no trade, no external communication of any kind. And its king was standing at her wedding reception. She looked back toward the eastern archway. Aldrich Vale was no longer looking at her. He was holding a glass and observing the room with the contained attention she had registered across the hall, and his expression gave her nothing she could read at this distance. But she was certain, with a clarity she could not have fully explained but did not doubt, that he had come here with a reason, and that the reason was not the one that would appear in any official record of tonight. She folded that certainty away with the care she gave to important things, and she returned to the reception, and she did not look toward the eastern wall again for the rest of that hour. But she knew exactly where he was in the room, at every moment, for the rest of the evening. She had not been able to explain, if asked, precisely how she knew. She simply did. And that, she thought, might be worth paying attention to, when she had the time and the quiet to do so properly. Shortly after midnight, Serafina made her exit from the main hall. She did it smoothly and without fanfare, the way she did most things that required precision without visibility. She told the group of diplomatic representatives she had been speaking with that she needed a moment of air after such a long and remarkable day, and she moved away with an unhurried step and a warm, reassuring smile that said this was nothing, that she would be back shortly, that everything was completely fine. The night garden at Whitmore Hall was accessed through a pair of glass doors at the back of the second reception room. She had noted their location during the estate orientation, and had quietly planned this exit during the 4th hour of the reception, when the formal stages of the evening were complete and the gathering had loosened into the slower, less structured movement of late-night conversation and wine. No one would notice her absence for at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes was enough. Outside, the air was cold and clean and absolutely still, the kind of cold that does not bite but simply makes itself known, a sharp and honest presence. The garden itself was formal and ordered, carefully shaped hedges along stone paths, benches set at intervals, the silver moon above making the pale gravel glow faintly. After 4 hours inside a hall with 240 people, the quiet around her was something she could feel physically, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she moved away from the glass doors and into the stillness. She walked to the first stone bench and sat down and allowed herself to breathe without any particular management for the first time all day. Just breathe. The cold air and the moonlight and the sound of the reception behind the glass, reduced now to a muffled current that was bearable rather than constant. She pressed her hands against her knees through the fabric of her gown and looked at the sky above the garden, which was clear and deep and full of the kind of winter stars that were only visible when there was no warmth in the air to blur them. She had been sitting for perhaps 2 minutes when she realized she was not alone. At the far end of the main garden path, standing beneath a stone archway threaded with leafless winter vine, was the man in midnight blue. He was facing slightly away from her, his hands in his coat pockets, his posture the kind of relaxed vertical that belongs to someone who is at ease in their own body, regardless of where they are standing. He gave every appearance of a man who had come outside to be alone with the cold and the dark, and had no interest in company. She considered this. She considered going back inside. The sensible thing to do with a rare interval of genuine solitude was to use it for exactly that, to collect herself, to steady the ground beneath her, to prepare for the final hours of the evening. This was a stranger, a significant stranger, with an unexplained presence and unverified intentions. Everything she knew about managing difficult situations suggested she should stand up, go back through the glass doors, and put this particular variable into the category of things to be addressed when she had more information. Instead, she said, "It is a cold evening for a garden." He turned without being startled. She noted this, the absolute absence of any surprise in the movement, as though he had known she was there, or as though the unexpected simply did not land on him the way it landed on other people. He looked at her with clear, steady eyes, in a shade she could not name exactly in the moonlight, somewhere between gray and green, and then he moved away from the archway and walked toward her with the unhurried step of someone who had decided something and was following through on it calmly. "It is," he said, stopping at a careful distance, not close enough to be presumptuous, not far enough to signal that he was indifferent to her presence. "I prefer it to the alternative. I find that cold air makes thinking considerably clearer." "Is that what you are doing?" she asked. "Thinking?" "Among other things," he said. He looked at her for a moment, with that same composed attention she had felt across the hall, and then he said, "I should say that I arrived late to this evening, and was not able to offer proper congratulations at any appropriate moment." "So, congratulations." "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He seemed to understand that she had not come out here to receive congratulations, and that the word had landed between them, with a weight neither of them was going to pretend it did not have. "I noticed you throughout the evening," he said, not as a compliment, and not as anything uncomfortable. As a statement of fact being offered because it was relevant. "You are very skilled at managing the public dimension of a difficult situation." She looked at him steadily. "That is a specific observation to make about a wedding reception," she said. It is a specific observation about the person I was watching, he said. She considered him. He was not performing anything she could identify. No charm, no deflection, no visible strategy. He simply said what he observed. This was, she found, more disarming than any amount of social skill would have been. "Why did you come?" she asked. "To this specifically. Vale has not attended any external event in 19 years. He accepted the directness of the question, without any visible discomfort. "I came because I had information that made me believe someone in this building deserved to have a witness who understood what they were standing in," he said. "I am being deliberately vague because we have just met, and I do not know yet how much you already know." She looked at him carefully. The cold air moved slightly around them, lifting the edge of her veil for a moment before setting it back down. "You may not need to be vague," she said. Something in his expression shifted, the smallest possible shift, a recognition settling into place behind those gray-green eyes. "I see," he said. "Tell me what you know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stone path in front of them, and then back at her, and she had the impression of a man who was deciding not how much to share, but how to share it accurately. "I know the terms of the Eastern Bloodline Accord," he said. "I have known them for approximately a year. My country's diplomatic operation identified the document as relevant to regional interests when it was first filed, because the Eastern Bloodline Clause has implications for territories well beyond the Northern Territory border." She did not react visibly. She kept her breathing steady, and her expression exactly where it had been. "I know that the accord was designed as a legal instrument," he continued, "and that the binding you completed this evening is one of its intended mechanisms." He paused. "I know that it was written before you were a person in this story, rather than a name in a clause." The moonlit garden was very quiet around them. "How did you come to be here in person?" she asked. "You could have sent a representative." He looked at her directly. "I came in person," he said, "because I wanted to see the kind of person you were. A representative would have sent me a description. I needed to see for myself. Why did it matter what kind of person I was?" He was quiet again. The pause was not evasive. It was the pause of someone who was giving an answer the full weight it deserved before producing it. "Because I have been thinking, for some time, about something I need," he said finally. "And I thought this might be as honest a situation as any in which to assess whether what I was thinking had any basis in reality. Watching how a person manages something genuinely difficult tells you more about their fundamental character than any introduction arranged specifically to produce a favorable impression." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars above the garden were very sharp and very still. "That is an unusual method," she said. "It is the only one I trust," he said. "Arranged impressions are arrangements. I have seen enough of those." "And what did you observe?" she asked. He considered. He seemed to be choosing not the most pleasing answer, but the most accurate one, which she recognized as a particular kind of respect. "Someone who heard something in a corridor this morning," he said, quietly and without elaboration, "and chose, entirely deliberately, to come down the aisle anyway. Not because she was without options, but because she had already determined what her options were, and what she intended to do about them. Someone who spent 4 hours in that hall tonight, performing a role that was considerably smaller than her actual capacity, and doing it without self-pity, and without a single visible crack." He paused. "Someone who walked out here to breathe and found me, and chose to ask direct questions instead of retreating behind safety." He met her eyes. "Someone I was right to come and see." The silence that followed was different from the others. It had a different quality, fuller, somehow, as though something that had been waiting at a distance had moved one step closer. "You were magnificent in there," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I have attended events like this before, in other lives and other contexts, and I know exactly what it costs to hold something like that together. No one in that hall would have known." She pressed her hands against each other in her lap. "And you did?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "How?" "Because I have done it," he said, "for years." "You learn to recognize the signs in other people once you have carried it yourself." She looked away from him for a moment, out toward the garden paths and the dark hedges and the moon above all of it. She felt something in her chest shift, not dissolve, not weaken, but acknowledge. The way a thing that has been held under enormous pressure for too long finally, just slightly, allows itself to be seen. She breathed through it carefully. That is either very perceptive or very dangerous, she said. In my experience, he said, those two things tend to occupy the same address. She looked back at him, and for the first time that day, the first time in several months, if she was being honest, she almost smiled. Not the careful social version, the actual one. They talked for another half-hour in that cold garden. Not about the wedding, or about Cale, or about the events of the day. Those things were present in the space between them, but neither of them named them. They talked about his kingdom, and what she knew of its history, and what he confirmed, and what he gently corrected. He answered her questions with the specific detail of someone who respected her enough to be exact rather than approximate. She told him about her grandfather and the Eastern Covenant documents, and what it had meant to grow up inside a name that carried more history than any one family could fully manage. At one point she told him something she had never quite said out loud to anyone, that she had always felt the weight of her bloodline not as a burden but as a debt, and that the debt had no clear terms, which made it impossible to know when or whether it could ever be settled. He was quiet for a moment after she said it. I understand that precisely, he said. The debts without terms are the ones that cost the most, because you can never put them down. You can only redefine what settling them means. He paused. I spent 16 years redefining that. I am still not certain I have arrived at the right definition, but the working version is considerably better than the one I started with. She looked at him. What is the working version? He thought about it. That the debt is not owed to the past, he said. It is owed to whatever future your inheritance makes possible, and the future does not require perfection. It requires presence. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, I should go back inside. I know, he said. He did not make any motion to stop her, or to extend the conversation past its natural point. Thank you for coming out here, he said, and for asking direct questions. It made the whole evening considerably more worthwhile. She stood. She straightened her gown. She looked at him one more moment in the moonlight, taking in the whole of what had happened in this cold, quiet space, in the middle of everything else, and she said, Good night, Aldrich Vale. Good night, Seraphina Ashwood, he said. Not Dorvain. Ashwood. And she registered that without comment, but did not forget it. She walked back along the gravel path and through the glass doors and into the warmth and noise of the reception, and she carried the conversation with her the way you carry something you found unexpectedly, and are not yet sure how to classify, but are quite certain you do not want to lose. The evening was ending, the guests beginning to move toward their various accommodations, and the remaining hours passed with the particular quality of time, at the end of a long, significant day, stretched and compressed at once, each moment slightly more vivid than ordinary moments, as though the day itself was aware of its own importance. She completed the final duties of the evening with precision and grace. She thanked people warmly. She said the right things in exactly the right order. She stood beside Cale at the entrance of the hall and watched the last carriages and vehicles depart through the estate gates, and the night air came in through the open doors and touched her face, and she thought about cold gardens and gray-green eyes, and the particular quality of honesty that she had not expected to encounter today of all days. Then Clara appeared to escort her to her rooms, and she followed through the quiet hall, and the door of the northern wing closed behind her, and she was finally, completely, alone. The rooms in the northern wing of Whitmore Hall were beautiful, in the kind of way that requires money and time, and the consistent attention of someone who understands that beauty should be functional. The sitting room had deep chairs, and a fireplace that had been burning since the afternoon. The dressing room held a mirror and a surface, and the kind of careful arrangement that said everything had been placed by someone who understood the difference between a room that served its occupant and a room that merely displayed itself. The bedroom had tall windows and good furniture, and the soft darkness of a room designed to allow rest. Clara showed her through each space with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had prepared many rooms for many people and had long since stopped expecting anyone to be visibly impressed. She mentioned the morning schedule in brief, wished her a good night, and left. Seraphina stood in the center of the sitting room and looked at the fire. The door had been closed for perhaps 30 seconds, and already the accumulated weight of the day was arriving without any particular announcement, settling across her shoulders and into her chest, the way weight does when you have been holding it at arm's length for many hours, and finally let it near. She did not fight it. She sat down in the chair nearest the fire and let it arrive. and she breathed through it steadily and carefully, the way she had breathed through the worst moments of the past several years, without drama, without collapse, without the false comfort of telling herself it was less than it was. The corridor. 3 seconds of silence before Cale's answer. The precise, level voice that had treated her presence in the arrangement as a logistical fact rather than a human one. The chapel. 200 people watching her walk toward a man who had described her, 20 minutes earlier, as a means to an end. The garden. A stranger in midnight blue, standing beneath a winter archway, looking at her with gray-green eyes and saying, "No one in that hall would have known." She sat with all of it. She sat with it until she could look at each piece of it clearly and without flinching, the way a surgeon examines a wound to understand it before beginning to address it. Not with coldness, she was not a cold person, but with the particular honesty that was the only useful tool she had ever found for situations that could not simply be felt through. The arrangement was exactly what she had overheard it to be. The financial provisions were real and already activated. Her brother's education would be funded. Her mother's estate was protected. The people of the Eastern Territories whose safety depended on the Ashwood bloodline's continued alliance record were secured. These things were true and were not nothing. What was also true was that she had been used as an instrument without being told she was being used as an instrument, and that the man who had done it had decided this was acceptable because the instrument in question had the good fortune to be capable and composed. She sat with that for a while. Then she stood, because she had never been able to think properly while sitting still for too long, and she went to the window and looked out at the dark grounds of the estate. The moon was high, and the formal garden paths below her window glowed faintly in the silver light. She could see, if she stood at the far right edge of the window and looked sideways, the stone archway at the end of the garden path, the archway where she had spoken to Aldrich Vale. She looked at it for a moment. Then she let the curtain fall back into place, went to the dressing room, and began the practical business of ending the day. She moved through it with the focused, systematic attention she gave to all practical things, and by the time she finally lay down in the dark bedroom, it was past 3 in the morning, and the grounds outside were completely still. Her mind did not slow. She thought about the accord. She had understood, from Cale's corridor conversation with Rowan, that the binding was being used to constrain the Eastern Pac Coalition's territorial challenge rights. She understood the legal mechanism, the bloodline clause, the covenant history, the symbolic weight of the Ashwood name. She understood all of that. What she had not fully thought through yet, lying here in the dark, was the question of what that made her position in the arrangement. If her presence was load-bearing in a legal structure, then she was not simply a consort performing a decorative function. She was a structural element, which meant she had more leverage than a decorative element would have, which meant she had been thinking about this wrong. She lay in the dark and thought about that for a long time. She also thought, at intervals that she did not try to control or suppress, about a man in midnight blue, standing under a winter archway saying, "You deserve better than standing in it without knowing." She thought about the quality of his attention and the specific, careful honesty of everything he had said, and the fact that he had come to her wedding from a kingdom that had been sealed for 19 years, which meant someone had thought this was worth the extraordinary step of opening a door. She was still awake when the clock in the sitting room marked 4. She was still awake when the deep black of the night outside began its slow, almost imperceptible shift toward the gray that preceded dawn. She slept sometime between 5 and 6, briefly, and not deeply. She woke at 7, to winter light filling the tall windows and the quiet sound of someone attending to the fire in the sitting room. She lay still for a moment, listening, then rose and wrapped herself in the heavy robe that had been left at the foot of the bed, and went into the sitting room. The fire was burning cleanly. On the small table beside the sitting room door, a tray had been placed with tea, a covered breakfast arrangement, and a small vase with a single white winter flower. Clara's people worked with a level of consistent thoroughness that she had already come to depend on. And on the floor just inside the door, half concealed beneath the edge of the table, was an envelope. She saw it the moment she came in. She crossed the room without haste and picked it up. It was plain. No crest, no territory seal, no identifying mark of any kind. Her name was written on the front in a hand she did not recognize, firm and clear, the writing of someone accustomed to saying things directly. She sat in the chair by the fire and opened it. Inside was a folded page, and inside the page were 2 things, a document, and a handwritten note. The document was a copy. The format was immediately recognizable to anyone who had spent time studying Northern Territory legal records. The formal heading of a binding accord, the date 3 years prior, the listed parties and conditions. She read it slowly, beginning at the first line and moving through every clause without skipping forward, because she had learned a long time ago that the most important information in any legal document is usually in the section you were least expecting. Her name appeared in the 7th clause. Seraphina Elaine Ashwood, of the Ashwood bloodline designation, Eastern Covenant Registration 14, to be secured through formal binding within the duration specified by the timeline addendum attached hereto. Secured. The word sat on the page with the weight of something that had been chosen very deliberately. She read on. The Eastern Pac Coalition was named as the party whose territorial challenge mechanism the accord was designed to constrain. 3 legal instruments were listed in order of priority. The binding of Seraphina Ashwood to Cale Dorvain was the second of the 3. She read to the final page. Then she set the document on her knee. The handwritten note was 2 lines. You should know what you are standing in, and you deserve better than standing in it without knowing. At the bottom, 4 letters. A.V. She looked at those 4 letters for a long time, long enough for the fire to shift and settle, and for the light outside the windows to strengthen from gray to the pale gold of a winter morning properly arrived. Aldrich Vale had known about this accord before he attended this wedding. He had come here not simply out of some abstract sense of witness or personal history. He had come in possession of specific, private information, and he had observed the evening as a person does when they already understand the context of what they are watching. And then he had slipped this envelope under her door at some hour between the end of the reception and the beginning of the morning. She turned the note over in her hands. She thought about the garden. She thought about his voice saying, I came because I had information that made me believe someone in this building deserved to have a witness. She thought about gray-green eyes that did not look away. She thought about what it meant that a king from a kingdom sealed for 19 years had chosen to open a door, even slightly, even briefly, in order to stand in a corridor on her wedding night and let her know she was seen. She set the note down beside the accord. She poured tea. She drank it slowly, looking at the fire, letting everything settle into its proper place in the architecture of her understanding. When the tea was finished, she placed both the document and the note carefully in the interior pocket of her personal portfolio case, the leather one she had brought from home, which held her own notes and records and the things she needed to keep close. Shortly after 8, a message arrived from Cale's office through Clara, informing her that a working breakfast would be available in the main dining room, and that the first week's administrative schedule had been prepared for her review. The message was efficient and impersonal, and exactly what she had expected, and she received it with the same composure she had maintained through everything else. She dressed with care, choosing her clothing with the same deliberateness she chose everything, not for beauty, though she was not indifferent to that, but for what it communicated. She was not going to this breakfast as a woman who had been shaken. She was going as a woman who had received important information and intended to use it. She went downstairs. She sat at the dining table. She ate breakfast with Cale at the far end of a long formal room, in a silence that was not comfortable and was not uncomfortable but simply accurate. The silence of 2 people who had signed the same document and were now sharing a table and had not yet determined what, beyond that, they intended to be to each other. She watched him. She did it quietly, from beneath lowered eyes, with the focused attention of someone collecting specific observations rather than general impressions. He was self-contained and entirely at ease, reviewing a document beside his coffee, with the absorbed concentration of someone doing work they were genuinely good at. He was, she acknowledged, extremely competent. He was also, she acknowledged, a person who had taken something from her without asking. Not dishonestly exactly. Not in any way she could have taken to a legal body, but without the basic courtesy of full disclosure, and had described this to his trusted second-in-command as simply how the arrangement worked. She finished breakfast. She thanked Clara, who appeared to review the week's schedule with her. She returned to her rooms and opened her portfolio case, and set the copied accord on the desk beside the window. Then she took out a fresh notebook page and wrote at the top of it, in her careful, abbreviated shorthand, "What I know, and what I intend to do about it." She began to write. It took 2 hours to get it all down properly. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, and read through what she had written, and the shape of it was clear and solid and exactly right. It was not a plan born from anger, though there was some of that, honestly, in the section she had put aside for later. It was a plan born from understanding what she actually had, which was more than she had been told, and more than Cale Dorvain had accounted for. An instrument that understood its own function was not an instrument. It was a negotiating party. She closed the notebook, slid it into the portfolio case, and set the case precisely in the center of her desk. The first morning of her marriage was done. There were 19 more before she intended to change the terms of everything. The first week of her marriage was, on its visible surface, entirely without incident. This was, she had decided by the third day, how Cale had designed it, not through any active effort to exclude her, but through the simple fact that his life ran on a schedule that had been precisely calibrated before she arrived, and her arrival had not altered that schedule in any functional way. He rose early. He was in his administrative office before 8. His days were organized around council communications, territorial management, the continuous dense correspondence generated by a kingdom of 6 aligned regions, operating under complex legal agreements. He was, she observed in these early days, genuinely excellent at the administrative work. He processed information at a speed that she found almost impressive, and he made decisions with the kind of confident precision that came from understanding a system deeply enough to know exactly what each decision would touch. He was not unkind to her. This was the specific thing she kept noting, because she had come into this week prepared for some version of indifference or dismissal, and the reality was something more nuanced than either. He was consistently correct. He asked after her comfort and her needs, with the exact frequency that the role required. He ensured through Clara that everything she needed was available. He included her in the morning schedule when it was appropriate to do so. He managed her, not aggressively, not with any intention that was cruel by his own definition, but with the careful, attentive efficiency of a person who has placed something in a part of their operation and is ensuring it functions as expected. She was part of the household now. He was ensuring the household ran correctly. She spent the first week learning Whitmore Hall. She approached this systematically, mapping the estate room by room across the days, not all at once but in deliberate portions, so that the knowledge she was building was solid rather than simply broad. She introduced herself to every member of the staff she encountered, taking time with each one to learn not just a name and a function, but the specific character of the person performing that function, because she had always believed that the real intelligence of a household was in its people, and that the people were worth understanding properly. The responses she received were instructive. Clara remained professional, but became incrementally less guarded once it became clear that Serafina had studied the household operation, before asking questions about it, rather than simply expecting to be informed of whatever seemed relevant. The head groundskeeper, Owen, a large, quiet man who had worked the Whitmore estate for 30 years, and whose pride in the formal gardens was the kind of pride a person develops over decades of genuine investment, was wary with her for 2 days, and then, after she asked him a specific and well-informed question about the frost resistance of the winter plantings along the northern path, became cooperative with a warmth she had not expected. The kitchen team were simply responsive to any sign of genuine interest, which she provided on the second afternoon, by asking carefully about the sourcing decisions behind the breakfast arrangements, and that was enough. She was building something. She did not announce this to anyone, but she was establishing herself as a person who was genuinely present in this place, who knew its people, and its operations, and its logic, and who was not going to be a decorative addition to its public image and nothing more. On the third day, she discovered that Aldrich Vale had not left the capital. She found this out from Clara, who mentioned it in passing during a morning schedule briefing as a minor logistical detail. The estate's diplomatic accommodation wing on the eastern edge was still occupied. The guests who had attended the wedding and required overnight accommodation had departed on the second morning, but one party had extended their stay under the diplomatic protocol that allowed a visiting sovereign party to remain for up to 30 days, without requiring a new formal invitation. "Which party?" Serafina asked. Clara gave her the name with the neutral efficiency she applied to all information, as though it was simply a fact among facts. Serafina received it with identical neutrality, and moved to the next item on the briefing agenda. She did not think about the implications until she was alone again, in the quiet of the library, where she had gone to continue her reading of the Northern Territory Legal Reference Collection. He was still here. not at a distance, not reduced to a note and a memory. Still here, on the same estate, within the same operational radius. She thought about that for a while, sitting in the library, with a legal reference volume open on the table in front of her, that she was no longer reading. She had not responded to his note. She had not been certain what a response would say, and she was not in the habit of communicating before she knew what she intended to communicate. She had thought about it, though, more than was strictly necessary for someone with as many other things to think about. On the 5th day, a message arrived in her morning schedule from Cale's office, an invitation, framed as optional, to attend a morning administrative briefing at 9. Several council and diplomatic representatives would be present. She was welcome to observe if she wished. The phrasing was careful. Welcome, if she wished to observe. Not required. Not expected. But suggested, in the precise, indirect way that Cale suggested things when he wanted them to happen. She went. The briefing room was in the administrative wing, a formal working space with a long central table, tall windows on the western side, and the sober, undecorated furnishing that communicated this was a room for substance rather than performance. When she arrived at 5 minutes before 9, the chamber was already occupied by several of Cale's administrative advisors and 3 diplomatic representatives, one from the Western Alliance, one from the Eastern Coastal Region, and one from Vale. Aldrich sat at the far end of the table. He was dressed in dark clothing, reading a document in front of him, and he did not look up when she entered. She took the chair that Clara had told her was the appropriate position for her in settings like this, near the head of the table, placed to observe rather than to direct, which was exactly how she had been categorized for the purposes of this room. For now, Cale arrived at exactly 9, which she was beginning to understand was a consistent pattern, arriving last, after everyone was positioned, so that the room oriented itself naturally toward him the moment he appeared. He greeted each person at the table by name and sat down and opened the session with the efficiency she had come to expect. The briefing covered territorial administration and 2 pending legal disputes about alliance boundary definitions. When the agenda reached the section on diplomatic relationship updates, the Vale representative was invited to speak. Aldrich spoke with the careful, measured language of someone who had been navigating formal diplomatic contexts for a long time. He gave a brief update on the kingdom's current position, which was presented as unchanged from its historically closed posture, but with a specificity in the language that suggested something was in motion beneath the surface. She listened to every word. She also watched Cale's face across the table while Aldrich spoke, and what she saw there was the particular attentive blankness that meant he was processing more than he was showing. And then, at one point during Aldrich's brief remarks, at exactly one point, lasting no more than 3 seconds, Aldrich looked directly at her. It was not the kind of look that would have meant anything to anyone else in the room. His expression did not change. His voice did not change. He simply looked, with those steady gray-green eyes, and there was in the look the acknowledgement of someone who sees you and wants you to know they see you. And that is the entire message, and it is enough. She looked back at him, with the same composure she was wearing for everything else in this room. She looked away first, which she had decided in advance. After the briefing, she returned to her rooms and sat at her desk and opened her portfolio case. She had continued her legal work each day since the wedding morning, adding pages of notes to the notebook, building a careful and detailed picture of the accord's structure and what it meant for her position. By the 5th day, she had reached a conclusion that she had been approaching since the 2nd day, but had wanted to verify from multiple angles before she allowed herself to fully commit to it. The accord had created a structure in which her marriage was not simply a symbol, it was a mechanism. The Eastern Pact Coalition's territorial challenge rights were suspended for as long as the binding remained valid, but suspended conditionally, which meant that if the binding dissolved before specific stabilization conditions were met, those challenge rights would not simply be restored, but would be restored with accumulated legal standing, under the principle that a challenge suppressed through covenant was worth more upon release than it had been before suppression. Which meant the entire Eastern territorial structure Cale had constructed over 3 years of political work rested on the continued fact of her marriage. Which meant she was not a peripheral figure in this arrangement, she was foundational to it. She sat with this understanding and felt its full weight. She did not rush past it into what it meant strategically, because she believed that every significant piece of information deserved to be felt as well as used. She had been placed here without being told what she was actually doing. That was worth the time it took to acknowledge what it cost. Then, when the acknowledgement was complete, she turned to a fresh page of the notebook and wrote, in her careful shorthand, a single line at the top. What load-bearing structures have in common with negotiating parties? And she began to write. By the end of the 5th day, she had the skeleton of what she was going to say, and when she was going to say it, and the outline of what she was going to ask for in return. It was not yet finished. She needed 2 more things before she could proceed. More information about the precise legal language of the review conditions, which she intended to find in the palace's legal archive, and 1 more conversation. A real one, not the careful briefing room eye contact of this morning, with the man who had placed the accord in her portfolio case. Because there were questions she needed answered before she could account for him in the picture she was building, and she did not account for variables she had not examined. She needed to know what Aldrich Vale actually wanted, not the diplomatic surface version, the real version. She had asked him why he came, and he had answered, and the answer had been honest but incomplete. She needed the rest of it. She always needed the rest of things before she could work with them. She set the notebook aside. She looked out the window at the dark winter grounds and the moon above them. Tomorrow morning she would go to the legal archive. The afternoon, she decided, she would use to think about how to ask for what she needed from the man in the diplomatic wing. On the 6th morning, Serafina went looking for the palace legal archive. She had identified its location on the 4th day, through an indirect method that she had developed during her family's years of financial recovery. When you need information that is not being freely offered, you find the person who manages the space where that information lives, and you ask them something adjacent to what you need, rather than asking directly. The information you get will be less than what you asked for, but it will usually be more than you would have gotten otherwise. In this case, the person was a young administrative staffer named George, who had the unfortunate quality of becoming considerably more informative when he was nervous, which he was in her presence, because she was the new lady of the house, and he had not yet calibrated how to speak to her. She had asked him about the organization of the administrative wing in a general way, noting that she was trying to understand how the estate managed its documentation. He had answered in considerably more detail than the question required, and among the details was the location of the archive, basement of the administrative wing, 3rd door, access managed by Edmund. She had not had the formal clearance for the archive when she identified it. By the 6th morning she did. Clara had arranged it the previous day, presenting it as a standard orientation step for new household members with administrative responsibilities, which Serafina, under the amended position she was beginning to establish for herself, was. The archive was a set of 3 rooms below the main administrative level, cooler than the floors above, and lined with shelves that held bound document sets organized by year and category. A quiet woman named Petra managed access and retrieval, and after the brief exchange of credentials that Serafina's clearance required, she was shown to a study table in the center room and asked what she needed. Northern Territory binding law, she said. Foundational documents and most recent amendments, and the Eastern Alliance Covenant, the full historical record, not the summary version. Petra looked at her for a moment, in the assessing way that archivists look at people who know what they are asking for. Then she went to retrieve the documents without further commentary. Serafina spent 6 hours in that archive. She read carefully, with the focused attention she could sustain for long periods when the material mattered enough. She read the binding law foundations and traced the specific provisions that governed her situation, following each clause through its historical development, to understand not just what it currently said but why, because the reason behind a legal provision told you far more about how it could be argued or amended than the provision itself ever could. She found what she had been looking for in an annotated commentary on the 7th edition of the binding law, a footnote in a section on covenant renegotiation that referenced a mechanism she had not known existed. Under certain conditions, a co-signatory who could demonstrate active participation in the covenant's operational execution could petition for formal recognition as a principal party rather than a listed instrument, which would change their legal standing within the agreement from passive to active. The conditions were specific and not easy to meet, but they were clearly articulated and they were achievable. She wrote the relevant clause numbers in her notebook with a pressure that left an impression on the pages below. She returned to her rooms in the late afternoon with her portfolio case full of notes and a clarity in her thinking that had not been there before. She made tea and sat by the window and worked through the implications of what she had found, mapping out the specific steps that would be required, and the order in which they would need to happen, and the point at which she would need to make the confrontation she had been preparing for since the second morning of her marriage. She also thought about the note she had been drafting in her head for 3 days. The note to Aldrich Vale. She had been thinking about the right phrasing since the morning after the briefing. The challenge was specific. The note needed to be formal enough to be appropriate, given that their actual relationship was stranger adjacent, a man and a woman who had spoken twice in private under unusual circumstances, and had not yet established what either of them intended to do about that. It needed to be clear about its purpose, without being explicit, in a way that would create the wrong impression in anyone else who might happen to see it. And it needed to ask for something, without appearing to ask for anything, because appearing to ask for things before you had established why you had the right to ask was a strategic error she was not going to make. She eventually wrote 3 drafts. She burned the first 2 in the sitting room fireplace, which struck her as slightly dramatic, but was the right call. The third one said, "Lord Vale, I understand you remain in residence for several days more. I would find it useful to speak, at your convenience, in the Palace Library, which is quiet enough for substance and public enough for propriety. At your earliest opportunity. S.A." That was right. Direct without being presumptuous. Specific about location, without explaining why the location mattered. S.A. rather than Seraphina Ashwood Dorvain, which was a small thing, but not an accidental one. She gave it to Fiona, who managed her correspondence with the reliable discretion of someone who understood that some communications were simply private, and she went to dinner, without allowing herself to think too much about whether or how he would respond. His response arrived with the evening correspondence, slipped into the stack of routine notes, with no indication of its origin, except the firm, clear hand she recognized from the wedding morning envelope. A single line. "Tomorrow morning. I will be there at 9. She folded it and placed it in the portfolio case and went to bed, and she lay in the dark for a while, running through what she intended to say in the library meeting, refining the questions she needed answered into their most direct and useful forms, the way she always prepared for conversations that mattered. The following morning, Celeste arrived at the estate. She had sent word 2 days earlier, asking if she could visit, and Seraphina had said yes, with a relief that she had not hidden from herself, even if she had not put it in the letter. Celeste arrived in the mid-morning while Seraphina was in the library, a fact that Clara communicated with a brief note, adding that the guest had been shown to the secondary receiving room. Seraphina came down from the library immediately. Celeste was standing at the window of the receiving room when she came in, looking out at the winter garden with the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she was not yet ready to say. She turned when Seraphina entered and they embraced. Not their usual restrained acknowledgement, but something more direct. The embrace of people who have been carrying separate versions of the same worry for a week, and are relieved to finally be in the same room. "You look better than I expected," Celeste said, holding her at arm's length and examining her with the particular accurate attention that had always been one of her most useful, and occasionally most inconvenient qualities. "I have been busy," Seraphina said, which was true, and was the part of the truth she was ready to offer. They sat down. Celeste did not immediately press her for information. She had always understood the difference between a moment that needed space and a moment that needed questions, and this was still a space moment. She asked about the estate, about the staff, about the practical texture of the first week, and Seraphina answered honestly about all of those things, because they were honest things to say, and because talking about the real and tangible details of her daily life was, she found, genuinely settling. "Are you sleeping?" Celeste asked eventually. "Better than the first 2 nights," Seraphina said. "And eating?" "Yes." Celeste looked at her carefully. "Something happened," she said. Not a question. An observation from a person who had known her long enough to read the specific quality of composure she was maintaining, and understand that it was not the ordinary kind. "Several things happened," Seraphina said. "I am not ready to explain all of them, but I want you to know that I am managing them." "Are you angry?" Celeste asked. She thought about this honestly. "Yes," she said, "but productively." Celeste absorbed this, and then, in the way she handled things, she could not yet directly address. simply nodded and said, "Tell me when you are ready. I am here." "I know," Serafina said. And she did know, and it mattered more than she was able to say properly, without the kind of feeling that she was saving for a time and place that was not a receiving room at mid-morning with a library appointment in an hour. They talked for another 40 minutes. About Celeste's work, her family, news from the Eastern Territories. About Colin, whom Serafina had already written with vague but reassuring news about the financial situation. About ordinary things, which were necessary and good, because ordinary things were what kept a person connected to the fact of their own life, when extraordinary things were pressing on them from too many sides. When Celeste left in the early afternoon, Serafina went upstairs to her rooms and sat at her desk for 20 minutes. She took out the notebook and reviewed the questions she had prepared for the library meeting. She read through her notes on the archive documents she had studied the previous day. She made sure everything in her thinking was organized and clear, and that she knew exactly what she needed to know, and exactly how she was going to ask for it. Then she gathered herself, picked up the portfolio case, and went to keep the appointment she had been moving toward since the wedding morning. He was already in the library when she arrived at 9. This was a detail she registered immediately, and chose for the moment not to interpret too heavily. Some people arrived early from courtesy. Some arrived early because they were habitually ahead of schedule. Some arrived early because being in a space before the other party arrived was a way of establishing a subtle kind of comfort, not dominance, exactly, but ease. She was not certain which of these applied to him, and she did not intend to build conclusions on insufficient data. She walked to the table where he was seated, and sat down across from him without ceremony. The palace library was a long, beautiful room. Shelves of carefully maintained books on 3 walls, tall south-facing windows admitting the cold morning light in clean, pale rectangles, a fireplace at the far end, already burning with the steady efficiency that indicated Whitmore Hall's staff had anticipated the room would be needed early. She had confirmed with Fiona the previous evening that no one was scheduled to use the space before noon. The room was very quiet. The estate was going about its morning outside these walls, but none of that reached in here. She set her portfolio case on the table beside her and looked at him directly. "I want to ask you things directly," she said. "Good," he said. "I find direct considerably more efficient than the alternative. How did you come to have a copy of the Accord?" He did not hesitate even slightly, which she noted as a positive signal about the quality of what was coming. "Diplomatic intelligence," he said. "My country's operation is limited. 19 years of isolation tends to thin the infrastructure considerably. But careful. 3 years ago, a contact of ours identified the Accord as having implications for territorial relationships that extended beyond the Northern Territory border, because the Eastern Bloodline Clause affects the legal standing of the Eastern Covenant, which several territories, including regions adjacent to Vale, are party to. We have been tracking the Accord's progress since. When I saw that a formal binding was imminent, I requested the full documentation." "And you came in person," she said. "Yes," he said, "because what I needed to know about this situation was not something any description could have answered." "What did you need to know?" He looked at her steadily. He was, she thought, a person who kept his eyes where he put them. He did not move his gaze around the way people do when they are calculating how to answer something. He seemed to have decided, at some point before entering this room, that he was going to say what he meant, and he was following through on that decision. "I needed to know whether you were aware of what you were standing in," he said. "And if you were, what you intended to do about it. And if you were not, I needed to find a way to remedy that before too much time passed." She absorbed this, and the note under the door was the remedy, he confirmed. "I did not know exactly how much you already understood when I placed it. I knew enough to know you deserved to have the document in your possession rather than simply knowing it existed. That was a considerable risk," she said. "The note could have been found by any member of the staff. The document could have been taken to Kale." "It could have," he agreed. "I calculated that you would not do that, and I calculated that any member of the staff competent enough to be trusted with correspondence delivery at that hour would be too professional to open a sealed envelope addressed to someone else. I was working with limited certainty." He paused. "I was also working with the judgment I had formed from watching you for several hours, which told me that you were the kind of person who safeguarded important information rather than broadcasting it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Your judgment about a person you had observed for several hours is apparently quite high by your own estimation, she said. It is, he said. I have been told this is either a gift or an arrogance, and I have not yet determined which. Possibly both. She almost smiled at this, because she recognized the cadence of it. Someone who had examined their own tendencies honestly enough to know what they looked like from the outside, and was choosing transparency over performance. She did not allow the almost smile to complete itself, because they were not yet at that point in this conversation. I want to understand why you came here personally, she said. Not the diplomatic reasoning, the personal one. He was quiet for a moment. Not a deflecting quiet. The room was too candid for deflection, and she suspected he was not a person who deflected when directness was available. It was the quiet of someone taking the time to say something accurately, rather than approximately. When I was 19 years old, he said, my father entered a political agreement that used my mother as a legal instrument, a territorial binding, structured through her bloodline and her family name. She was told it was a partnership, a genuine alliance, based on mutual benefit. What she was not told was that she had been identified as the solution to a problem my father needed to solve, and that her willingness to participate was assumed rather than genuinely sought, because the conditions of her situation made saying no effectively impossible. He paused. His voice had not changed. It remained level and measured, but there was something in it that was different from the ordinary diplomatic calm he had used at the briefing table, something with weight beneath it. She found out approximately 3 years into the marriage, he continued. Not from my father. From a document she came across while organizing his papers. The same way that kind of information tends to surface, incidentally, without ceremony, without any of the context that would have made it easier to receive. By that time the legal structure was such that dissolving the binding would have caused more damage to her family's people and the territories dependent on the alliance than staying would. She understood this, and she stayed. She managed the situation with a degree of skill and composure that I have never seen matched. She was, by any honest accounting, exceptional. But, Serafina said, she spent 20 years living a version of her life that had been decided for her, without her knowing what she was deciding, he said. I watched this. From the time I was old enough to understand what I was watching until she died, when I was 33, and the thing I could never resolve, the thing that stayed with me after everything else had settled, was that she was never given the real choice. Not because my father was a monster. He was not a monster. He was a man who had a problem and a solution, and who did not, at the crucial moment, stop to ask whether the solution involved a person who deserved to be asked. The library was very still around them. The fire cracked once and settled. I closed the kingdom, he said, when I was 19, because it was the only significant thing under my authority that I could withhold, and I needed to withhold something. I needed to register an objection, using the only language available to me. In retrospect, 19 years of closure was perhaps not the most proportionate response. He said this with a dry, precise quality that was not quite humor, but was not without it. But I was 19, and I was very angry, and I was not yet the person who would have made a different decision. And you have spent the years since rebuilding, she said. Yes, he said. The kingdom's internal infrastructure, the administrative systems, the economic foundations that isolation had weakened. It has been a long and not uncomplicated process. I am now in a position where opening the borders is genuinely possible rather than simply theoretically desirable. He looked at her. And I have been thinking, for approximately a year, about what opening them requires. Not just administratively, personally. What kind of judgment, what kind of perspective, what kind of honesty I need beside me when I do something that cannot be undone. You are describing a particular kind of partner, she said. Yes, he said. I am. She looked at him directly. You came to my wedding to assess me for that role. He met her gaze without any visible deflection from the precision of that statement. I came, he said, because your name was in a document that concerned me, and because I needed to see what kind of person was attached to that name. I was not operating on the assumption that what I was looking for would be there. I was simply following the information to its source and seeing what I found. And what did you find? She asked. He considered. She noticed, as she had noticed in the garden, that he seemed to approach the question of what he observed with a genuine care, as though accuracy mattered more to him than palatability, and as though he had enough confidence in his own judgment to offer it without extensive hedging. Someone who received a devastating piece of information on her wedding morning, he said, and made the decision to move forward anyway. Not through resignation or fear, but through a specific, deliberate strategy that she had constructed in real time and executed without a single visible error. Someone who spent an entire evening in a room full of powerful, observant people and gave none of them any indication of what was actually happening inside her. Someone who sat in a cold garden at midnight and asked direct questions instead of retreating into the safety of social performance. He paused. Someone who, if the conditions were different, would be exactly what I described. She let this settle for a moment. I am currently in a binding, she said, under Northern law. I am not in a position to make any decisions about anything outside the arrangement I am currently in, and I am not the kind of person who would allow myself to be in a position to make those decisions under conditions of duress or insufficient information. I know, he said. I am also not, she continued, the kind of person who allows another person's assessment of her, however flattering, to function as a substitute for my own judgment about what I want and what I am prepared to do. I know that too, he said. And I want to be very precise about something. I am not here to offer you anything that requires a decision today. I am not asking you to want anything. I am not asking you for any response to what I have said, other than the one you are prepared to give honestly, on whatever timeline honesty requires. She looked at him. Then what are you here for? He was quiet for a moment. To have given you the information I had, he said, and to have had this conversation, and to let you know that if the time ever came when you were ready to have it again, under different conditions, with better ground under your feet, I would be there for that conversation. She studied him carefully, the way she studied everything that mattered, looking for the gap between what was being presented and what was actually there. She did not find one. This was either because he was extremely skilled at concealing it, or because there was none to find. She had met enough people of both kinds to know that the absence of a detectable gap was not the same as a guarantee, but it was the best information she had. I appreciate the directness, she said finally. I appreciate you receiving it, he said. She stood. She gathered her portfolio case. She looked at him for one last moment across the width of the table, taking a mental note of everything she had observed and everything she intended to think about more carefully when she was alone. Thank you for coming, she said, and for the honesty. Both times. Thank you for asking, he said. Both times. She left the library and walked back through the administrative wing with the careful, unhurried step she used when she needed to appear completely unrattled. She had nearly reached the staircase when she turned the corner and came face to face with Cale and Edmund, walking in the opposite direction. Cale stopped when he saw her. His eyes moved briefly, almost imperceptibly, but not imperceptibly enough, to the closed library door behind her at the end of the long corridor. Then they came back to her face. "Good morning," she said, with the exact composure she had maintained through every exchange with him that week. "Good morning," he said. There was a quality in his voice this morning that was different from the ordinary managed correctness of their previous exchanges. Not accusatory, not cold, but more alert than usual, in the way that a person is alert when they have just revised an assumption and are working to understand the implications. "You were in the library," he said. "Yes," she said. "I find the legal reference collection useful." He looked at her. There was something moving behind his silver eyes that she was watching for, without letting him see that she was watching. "Edmund tells me Lord Vale has extended his stay under the diplomatic protocol," he said. "So I understand," she said. "It is within the standard allowance." He was quiet for one moment. That was exactly one beat longer than it needed to be. "Yes," he said, "it is." He continued past her, and Edmund gave her a precise nod, and they moved on down the corridor, and she walked to the staircase with the particular clear knowledge that a clock, somewhere in this building, had just started running, and that everything she needed to do, before it reached its end, needed to be done with more urgency than she had previously planned for. She was not alarmed by this. She simply adjusted her timeline accordingly.